Marshal Ethan Reed was left for dead with a bullet in his back, framed for crimes he tried to expose. Leading the hunt was Clyde Brenner, a bounty man who twisted the law to bury the truth and silence anyone in his way. But fate brought Ethan to Grace McCallan, a woman who'd already lost her brother to the same darkness. And this time, she wasn't going to let it happen again. Just wait until you see how this standoff unfolded and why, in the end, justice didn't just survive, it won. The air was still, heavy with the scent of last night's rain and scorched prairie. Morning crept in slowly over the Oklahoma ridgeline, casting golden streaks through the twisted limbs of scrub oaks and the rusted skeleton of a windmill that hadn't turned in years. Grace McCallan stepped out onto her porch with a battered lantern in one hand and a Winchester in the other, more out of habit than fear. Life in the high plains taught her long ago. Peace was fragile, and danger didn't always ride in with thunder. She nearly tripped over him. At first, she thought it was a coyote or a ranch hand lost in the dark. But as the dawn carved clearer lines into the world, she saw the glint of silver on his chest, a marshal's badge smeared with blood and half buried under dust. He was face down in the dirt, one arm twisted unnaturally beneath him, his back soaked through. The wound was hidden, but the pain etched into his face made it clear. He wouldn't last long lying there. Grace didn't ask who he was or what he had done. She acted. Dragging a full-grown man inside was no easy task, especially not with a bad hip and an old scar that still ached when the weather changed. But she managed, laying him on the sofa by the fireplace, his breath shallow, his skin cold despite the heat that lingered from the storm. She wiped the dirt from his badge and read the name, Marshal Ethan Reed. The name meant nothing to her, yet. But the wound in his back told her something more valuable than any document or explanation. Someone had meant for this man not to live. And someone had been close enough to make it personal. She heated water, tore clean strips from an old cotton dress, and began to work, her hands steady from years of field practice. She didn't ask questions, not yet, but the storm outside wasn't the only one still rumbling. She could feel it in the wind, in the silence, in the way her dog hadn't barked once since dawn. He moaned once, a ragged breath barely escaping his throat. His eyes fluttered, glassy and lost, but they didn't meet hers. He wasn't fully there, his mind trapped somewhere between fever and whatever memory had brought him to her doorstep. Grace had seen soldiers like that during the war, men who'd run far, only to be caught by something worse than the enemy. She sat beside him, the rifle across her lap, and waited. The sun was rising slowly, too slowly, and the thoughts circled in her mind like buzzards over dry bone. No one shows up shot in the back unless they were either running or betrayed. And if someone wanted this marshal gone badly enough to shoot him in the back, they wouldn't leave him to chance. They'd come to finish it, probably by sunrise. The fire had burned low by the time Ethan Reed opened his eyes. Grace sat in the far corner of the room, arms crossed, her face half lit by flickering orange light. She didn't speak at first, neither did he. The kind of silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the silence of two people who had seen too much to waste words on small talk. When he finally moved, it was with the stiff, cautious breath of a man who'd been running on borrowed time. He reached instinctively toward his sidearm, but it was gone. Grace raised an eyebrow and gave the slightest shake of her head. "You were bleeding through your spine and barely breathing. I figured you didn't need it," she said calmly. Ethan's voice was dry, hoarse. "How long?" "Few hours. Enough for the fever to start kicking in." He looked around the room, her modest cabin lined with faded portraits, an old clock that hadn't ticked since Grant left office, and a worn Bible resting on the shelf with a flower pressed between its pages. It wasn't much, but it was clean, quiet, and far from anyone who asked too many questions. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "That part's obvious." He winced as he shifted his weight, then met her eyes for the first time. They were steady, unreadable. "You shouldn't have helped me. I've made worse choices." The silence returned for a moment, broken only by the slow hiss of the wood settling in the fire. Grace studied him carefully. He wasn't old, but something in his face made him look older, creased at the edges, heavy behind the eyes. Men like him didn't break easily, and yet here he was, broken. When the fever began to rise again, he started talking. Not clearly. Not by choice. but the words came anyway, jumbled and raw. Douglas Creek. They buried them. Ranch house near the well. Nobody believed me. Said I broke protocol. Said I was helping them, but I saw what they did. To the witnesses. To the boy. His voice cracked, and his breathing turned shallow. Grace pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and leaned in, trying to catch more, but the rest was a whisper lost to sleep. Yet it was enough. Douglas Creek. That name hadn't crossed her ears in months, not since her brother's funeral. Tom McAllen had died wearing a badge just like Ethan's. The official report said he'd walked into a shootout and been caught in the crossfire. But even then, something hadn't felt right. The timeline, the missing evidence, the lack of any arrests. It had gnawed at her for a year, but she had no proof, no leads, only grief. Until now. Ethan wasn't just another lost lawman. He was part of the same machine that had chewed up and silenced her brother. And now it was after him too. Her thoughts turned sharp, focused. She'd learned long ago that when the law started turning on its own, you couldn't trust badges or titles, only actions. And right now, Ethan Reed's actions told her more than any speech ever could. He had seen something, tried to stop it, and paid the price. He hadn't come here by accident. Grace stood, pulled the rifle off the wall, and checked the rounds. She didn't know who would come looking for him next, but if it was the same kind of men who'd buried the truth a year ago, then this time, she would be ready. The land had a stillness before dawn, unnatural, like something holding its breath. Grace felt it before she heard them. The soft rhythm of hooves on packed earth, deliberate and slow. Not the hurried pace of travelers or the rattling gallop of ranch hands. These were men who wanted to be heard just enough to announce themselves, but not enough to give away their intent. She stepped outside, closing the door behind her with a quiet thud, and rested her hand on the stock of her rifle. A soft layer of mist hugged the ground, clinging to sagebrush and fence posts like a veil. The sky in the east had just begun to brighten, and the pale light caught the shapes moving through the fog. 3 riders, side by side, like shadows pulled from the hills. Leading them was a tall man with a long brown coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shade. But Grace didn't need to see his eyes to know who he was. Clyde Brenner, the name had weight around these parts. Once a decorated soldier. Later a man who'd swapped a badge for a bounty ledger. He called himself a contractor now, but everyone else called him what he was, a cleaner, someone hired to erase loose ends before they could speak. And, judging by the cold stillness in his approach, Ethan Reed was his latest assignment. Clyde stopped 10 yards from the porch, his boots shifting in the stirrups. The other 2 flanked him like trained hounds, watching every window and shadow around the cabin. "Mornin', Miss McAllen," he called, voice steady and unhurried. "Heard you might have had company last night." Grace didn't flinch. "Can't say I have." "That's so?" Clyde tilted his head. "Funny. One of our boys saw a rider head this way just before the storm broke. Might have been hurt. Might have had a badge. We'd like to speak with him." Grace stepped down off the porch, rifle still low, but both hands firm. "You think I'm hiding a wounded lawman in a one-room cabin with no help? No horse and no neighbors for 20 miles? Clyde smiled. It wasn't friendly. "I think you're the kind of woman who doesn't scare easy. That can be admirable. Or dangerous." A long pause followed, the kind where words were useless and intent filled the space between breath and movement. Grace's heart beat slow but strong. She didn't blink, didn't shift. Then, softly, she said, "There's no Marshal here. But if there were, I'd say he earned the right to be heard before someone puts him in the ground." That was the moment something changed. Clyde's smile thinned. He adjusted his reins. The man to his left tensed, just slightly. Grace saw the motion, subtle as it was, and stepped back toward the porch. "Then I suppose we'll check for ourselves," Clyde said. "You take one step past that gate," Grace replied, her voice calm, "and the next sunrise might come without you." The riders held still. Inside the cabin, Ethan stirred. He had woken the moment hooves hit dirt, and though his body barely responded, his mind had returned to one thought. They found me. He reached for the sidearm Grace had laid beneath his pillow, a quiet act of preparation, not for escape, but for what he knew was inevitable. Outside, the silence hung heavy once more. Clyde studied Grace, trying to decide if she was bluffing. She wasn't. Finally, he tugged at the brim of his hat. "We'll be back," he said. "I'll be waiting." The riders turned slowly, disappearing into the mist the same way they'd come. But Grace knew better than to believe it was over. That kind of man didn't ride out empty-handed. He was circling, waiting for the light to rise just enough to cast shadows exactly where he wanted them. And when he came back, it wouldn't be to talk. The sun was climbing fast now, burning away the mist like truth chasing down a lie. Grace stood on the porch, her rifle resting against the corner post, but her eyes never left the line of trees beyond the edge of her land. She knew what was coming. It was only a matter of when. Inside, Ethan struggled to sit upright. His breathing was labored, but clearer than it had been the night before. He had insisted on getting out of bed, wrapping his side with strips of cloth Grace had cut from an old quilt. He gritted his teeth through the pain, not out of pride, but because he knew weakness could not walk beside survival. "They're not leaving," he said, voice low. "No," Grace answered. "They're just waiting until they think we're tired enough to make mistakes." Ethan looked at her. This woman who had no obligation to help him, no promise of reward. Just a memory of her brother and the buried truth both of them had been left to carry. "You should run." "I did," she replied. "Once. I'm done running." From the hill, the faint snap of a branch cut the air like a warning. Grace took position by the window, eyes scanning the brush. A flicker of movement, then another. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. The first man stepped into view with his weapon drawn, moving fast across the clearing toward the cabin's side. Grace fired a single round, not to hit yet, but to slow him. It worked. He ducked behind the fence and everything went still. Then came Clyde's voice, clear and sharp like flint on steel. "Last chance. Give him up and we walk away." Ethan stood in the doorway now, revolver in hand. His legs trembled, but his eyes burned with clarity. "You had your chance, Brenner," he called out. "But you picked the wrong people to silence." There was a long pause. Then a single shot cracked through the trees. Grace fired back, instinct sharp, pulse steady. She wasn't aiming to prove a point. She was aiming to survive. The second man, one of Clyde's partners, emerged near the woodpile, but stumbled and fell as Ethan caught him off guard. The Marshal didn't miss. Grace saw the third silhouette try to circle wide toward the barn. She moved fast, cutting across the porch and kneeling by the rain barrels. From there, she caught him in the open and warned him once. He didn't take the warning. When the dust cleared, Clyde stood alone, halfway between the trees and the house. His weapon hung low now, and his shoulders rose and fell with a slow, frustrated breath. "You're making a mistake," he called. "That man in there betrayed his own. You think he's any different than the others?" Grace stepped out, rifle aimed, boots crunching across dry earth. "My brother believed in the law," she said, "and men like you made him disappear. That mistake was mine. This one won't be." Clyde didn't move. For a long second, it looked like he might surrender, but he didn't. The shot that followed echoed for miles. When it was over, Ethan stood behind her, silent. The dust began to settle. The land exhaled. And the law, twisted, broken, and buried deep, took on new meaning between them. It no longer belonged to the men who carried it like a weapon. It belonged to those who remembered what it was meant to protect. By the time the sun stood high over the ridgeline, the fight was long behind them. The silence that followed wasn't filled with fear. It felt earned, like a final page turned. Grace stood by the fence, arms crossed, watching as Ethan adjusted the saddle on a weathered gelding. He still moved with effort, but there was steadiness in him now, the kind that comes when a man chooses to stop running. "You'll be safe for a while," she said. He looked back at her, his voice low. "Safe isn't enough. I need the truth to matter again." Grace nodded, the breeze brushing strands of hair across her face. "Then you know where to start." He climbed into the saddle and lingered a moment, the cabin behind him, the open land ahead. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been understood. She watched him ride west, toward whatever justice still lived beyond the hills, and when he was gone, she turned back to the porch, not with fear or sadness, but with quiet certainty. The storm had passed, and so had the silence.